All right. Good afternoon, everyone. We hope that you are doing well today, and thank you so much for joining us. My name is Cynthia Klein, and I serve as the project director for the ARC Take Heart initiative. On behalf of our full team, I want to welcome you to the Take Heart Module 3, which will continue the discussion of systems change with a focus on cardiac rehabilitation workflow processes for referrals and care coordination, including the collection of data. Next slide. So today's presentation is the third in a series of 10 modules to provide implementation support and share best practices with Take Heart hospitals who are implementing automatic referral with care coordination. As a reminder, all of our Take Heart training modules are guided by the roadmap that's been established by the Million Hearts Cardiac Rehabilitation Change Package, or the CRCP. And that change package is located on the Resource Center within the Take Heart website. The Take Heart website is also a one-stop shop for all of our educational materials for the initiative, including resources and even the training session recordings. The format of our training sessions include a subject matter expert presentation. Today we'll have with us Dr. Steve Katayan and also Mackenzie Peckman. And with the discussion that will happen through the chat and the polling features, so that you're able to dialogue with participants and allow that peer-to-peer sharing. Hospitals will also receive written guidance material to reinforce and supplement the material that we have presented in today's training session. And then technical assistance will follow next week as partner hospitals join their peer action groups. The peer action groups will meet with their assigned coaches to discuss concepts presented today and provide updates on progress, successes, challenges with the project and with implementation. The peer action groups also offer participating hospitals the opportunity to share and offer support to other hospitals in their groups. So remember, following this session, you'll have the opportunity to discuss further with your peer action groups. And as always, you can reach out to your coaches anytime between meetings for questions and concerns. All right, I'd like to go ahead and pass you off to Steve Hines, who will serve as the moderator for today's discussion. Thank you.
Excited about what we've got to share with you today. Looking at we want to encourage each of you to use the chat function throughout to ask questions, make comments to the panelists. We'll be paying attention to those. We'll try to respond to them either orally or in the chat, and in some cases we may even follow up with you afterwards if you've asked a really great question that we want to help you with. So, but please remember in the chat to set the field to everyone so that we can all see your question. If you just set it to all attendees, the panelists won't be able to see your questions. So we encourage you to chat if you want to just send in a greeting to see how it works now. Before we move any further, I'd encourage you to do that. We're also going to ask a polling question. We always like to see what you're interested in and how you're responding or what you're thinking about. So when we get to that, we'll review this, but basically those questions will come up on the right side of your screen and you can just answer them and hit submit afterwards, and we'll be able to see the results before we move on. So just as a review, we want every single hospital that's a part of Take Heart to succeed in it. And so to succeed, you need to really understand why automatic referral and care coordination matter. And that was the focus of Module 1, which we covered a month ago, along with Module 2, which focuses on the groundwork that you need to lay in order to have a team in place so that you can successfully implement automatic referral and enhanced care coordination. So that's where we have been, and those slides are all available on the Take Heart website, and we've sent out a link of the recording of the event to each of the participants as well. If you don't have that, ask your PAG lead and we can point you to that. But then today, before we leap into changing automatic referral, directly enhancing care coordination, we want to essentially stop and pause and look before you leap into those things. So really the focus of today is understanding how your patient referral and care coordination processes really work And that involves understanding the process of process mapping. And that will allow you to identify problems, process failures that you'll need to address, and also kind of lay the groundwork for understanding where your data is coming from that you'll need in order to monitor your progress over time. So, and then next week or in next month, we'll focus on the data component of the project before we move into automatic referral, starting with module 5. So that's where we currently are. And we want you to understand your workflow processes before you leap into changing them. So as far as where we need to go now, we'd like to just remind you, if you'd like to get CEU credits for today's event, you can request them, and you'll receive within the next 2 days an email that has all of the information required in order to comply with and request your CEU credits from AbQuarp. So you'll get that automatically if you've registered for today's event. You need to have completed the event, and you'll need to respond to the questions that you'll be given as you register to get your CEU credits. As far as the learning goals for today's event, we want you to understand the importance of mapping key processes and identifying process failures. We want you we want to equip you so that you can map current workflow processes. We understand some of you may be very sophisticated, maybe mapping things already. And we understand that others of you may really just not know that much about mapping of processes at all. And we'll try to give useful suggestions for you wherever you are in that process. That's what we're focusing on today. And then third, we want to identify implementation gaps and process failures that you'll need to address in order to really have an effective automatic referral and care coordination process. So having said that, let's start off with a polling question. And we just would like our panelists and everyone to just kind of know what you're thinking about process mapping as we get started today. So take a second, if you would, and just choose the option of those 5 that you would say best describes your status, from completely unfamiliar with workflow process mapping, to a little familiar and a little skeptical, to a little familiar but positive general impression, to you've done it a lot and you thought it was great, or you've done it a lot and you're skeptical. If you have skepticism, that's natural, but I think our panelists today will be able to give you some advice that will enable you to make this a really worthwhile activity. All right, I think that the poll has closed, and we should be able to see the results from the poll in just a second here, so we can see where our audience is before we transition to our 2 expert panelists. It seems like the largest category, for those that were able to find the submit button and hit that in time, is not a lot of prior experience, but believe that it can be useful. Not a lot of skepticism, which is great. Some people saying that they have had a lot of experience and it's positive, so that's great. I'm hopeful that by the end of today you'll have a much better understanding of the process, as well as a more positive attitude towards how it can help you in your program. So having said that, let's transition, and I'm delighted to introduce our 2 panelists today. Stephen Katayan is the Director of Preventive Cardiology at the Henry Ford Hospital in Detroit, and he's also a professor in the Department of Physiology at Wayne State University's School of Medicine. And in addition to patient care responsibilities, Dr. Katayan is actively involved in NIH-funded clinical research, focusing on the role of exercise in patients with cardiovascular disease, with an emphasis on patients with chronic heart failure. He's a member of the American Heart Association and the Clinical Exercise Physiology Association, and he's a fellow of the American Association of Cardiovascular and Pulmonary Rehabilitation. And I've had the pleasure of working with Stephen Katayan on a couple of prior events and activities, and am deeply appreciative of his contributions then as well as his contributions today. Mackenzie Kekman is our second panelist for today. And Mackenzie is a clinical exercise physiologist certified through ACSM with over 14 years in the area of cardiac and pulmonary rehabilitation. During the past 9 years, she's also served as the clinical team lead with the Asperis Wausau Hospital Cardiac and Pulmonary Rehab Department, accepting positions as regional representative and co-chair for the program support committee for the Wisconsin State Cardiac and Pulmonary Rehab Organization. She's been a driver for cardiac rehab within the Asperis organization, and she's helped to drive positive program outcomes and best practices. And really importantly, she's used process mapping to figure out how to accomplish that, and she'll be sharing her experiences with that today. So having said that, I'm going to turn it over to Stephen, and I'd ask that all of the other panelists, if you could just check and make sure that you're muted. We're getting just a little bit of background noise. Having said that, Stephen, I'll turn it over to you.
Well, thanks very much, Steve, and my sincere thanks to the Take Heart program for providing me an opportunity to connect with my colleagues on this topic. Before digging in on the material that's prepared, I just wanted to provide two quick background, kind of some of its summative statements from myself. And the first one is I recognize fully that many of us did not go to school for how to learn mapping. Some of us have picked it up along the way, and that includes some of us may feel that we already know how to correct things in our programs. And so I'm going to take that as a given. It's in those 2 points as an assumption. But I'll also say that more so than ever before, cardiac rehabilitation sits on a stepping off point that professional organizations and NIH-funded research and initiatives within the medical community are really pushing cardiac rehabilitation forward, and to help fix this enrollment gap that we know exists. So we're part of the fix. So part of the fix also includes, doing it with data. Who do we work with? What's the care coordination process? And this is where mapping can be quite helpful. So I'm both feet in on this. And again, it's, I look forward to presenting you some hopefully new information or supportive information on how to move forward. And a lot of this will make sense as you start to get in your support groups and work on this. So that is a backdrop. The mapping tool becomes very important to me. Care coordination becomes very important to me. And it's going to show us what we have to do, our strengths, our successes, our weaknesses, our failures, and that's where we want to move forward. So here we go. We've got this nice broad, paradigm of like who's involved and who should we understand this process, and it really is across the spectrum. And one of the key components to this, in addition to people we would work with on referral, but there's some other partners outside the immediate, heart team, so to speak. It's our billing department, it's our IT department, it's our coding. We can get analytics out of our EMRs, who does our scheduling. These are other people that you have to start thinking about, that you have to integrate into your thinking as we work on the process. But it also involves the patients, getting input from them into the process. And guys, it's not just our current patients, and it's not just graduates, but we probably should also involve people that maybe even had a heart attack. What would they want to see if they have a heart problem? What steps, what eases, what strains do they want to see as they get into cardiac rehabilitation? But also people who have said no to cardiac rehabilitation, digging in with them to finding out, was it something from a process point of view, or was it personal instances that caused them to decline, or work instances that caused them to decline? Are there barriers that we can work into the map that we want to help overcome? So as we map out this journey and we start to capture the key patient perceptions and perceptions along the way, who do we want to ask? Ask the patients that I talk about, include those patients that, as I mentioned, that, might not have been involved in cardiac rehabilitation before, list out their concerns and look for opportunities for improvement. So this is soup to nuts, you guys. Everything from the beginning of when a patient might be eligible for cardiac rehabilitation, an ACS event, coronary revascularization, hospitalization for heart failure, maybe an outpatient ambulatory care referral. That any patient that is eligible starts this ball. And then there's everything on the other extreme, graduating the patient from cardiac rehabilitation. And everything in between is open to this process of trying to help get our arms around how do the referrals happen, where's the data flow, who do we have to coordinate with to make this all work in a successful manner. And what are the sources that we would have for getting patients into the into our program? Obvious ones would be an inpatient referral from either, let's say, an ACS, acute coronary event, or an inpatient procedure, PCI, CABG, transplant, LVAD, whatever it happens to be. But getting him into a phase 2 early outpatient program can also come from an outpatient setting. Maybe the person had their event in Florida and now they've moved back up to Michigan and they want to get into cardiac rehabilitation or re-pick up with cardiac rehabilitation. It could come from the ambulatory side, and then physician practices, which may not be EMR linked into your hospital. It might be a fax referral, or the patient themselves may have just left the physician's office with a piece of paper, and we want to plug them into the process as well. So we have to think of all these different forces or sources for getting patients into cardiac rehabilitation. So how do we map this process out? We're going to have several opportunities to go ahead and do this. One, as you can see here, is a very not gross, but very rough, multicolored approach where maybe we just use sticky pad notes and map out the process along the way. But as we move forward, we want to make sure we're capturing key, representations of major activities. So what activities are in the referral process? What tasks have to take place to move patients along the process? Are there decision points? Yes to this, no to that. If yes, then we go in this direction. If no to cardiac rehab, maybe who follows up? And who's doing the roles? Who's involved with the roles? We can move through this sticky note process fairly quickly in a big picture, but you'll see as we go through, and especially as you break into your peer groups, that you can get more and more granular and start to refine the process. Always looking for trying to remove variation, try and improve process handoffs along the way. So there are some common elements that you want to use as you map these out, and you'll see this as you get hands-on. There's this oblong or rounded edged rectangle that if you use this in your mapping process, that usually means the beginning or an end, a start or a stop point. And then you've got this, pure rectangle where you actually would list out, break down, what are the activities or tasks that we want to get involved that are happening along the way that we have to break down or identify. And then you've got the diamond, and the diamond would literally be a decision point. Patient starts cardiac rehabilitation or signs up for cardiac rehabilitation. It might be schedule orientation or schedule first visit, or a patient completes cardiac rehabilitation, and it might be an offshoot that is, yes, it is, and then it might be if yes, then schedule graduation packet and discharge summaries with patient. So these are yes, no decision points along the way. So before getting granular, let's look at what a whole process, an abbreviated whole process, what might look like on the left-hand side. And you can see it literally begins with patient is eligible for cardiac rehabilitation. And if yes, that's a decision point. If yes, then look at the procedure and how are they entered into the EHR, and is EHR going to trigger a prompt into cardiac prompt for cardiac rehabilitation. But they could say, patient's not eligible, and make sure they're getting good ambulatory care follow-up. But I would even extend that and say, is somebody contacting them to find out why they weren't eligible, or if it's because they were out of town, did we give them a local You know, we could extend that further and say, did we give them a local number? So we can use, you can clearly see here, this really maps out to the left side here, really maps out a lot of the steps using rectangles and activities that go through. And then it finishes with this kind of this rounded rectangle at the bottom right, on the left side panel of the patient graduates from cardiac rehab. On the right side of this figure is something, I'm just trying to give you the whole part whole concept here. And that is, you know, we're going to blow up and we're going to extend these individual tasks and these individual decision points to make sure if there's data that has to be collected, if there's people that has to be involved, if there has to be tasks that have to be blown up, we'll blow these up, these rectangles up as we move through the process. So here's an example of just blowing up the decision-making point, which is your you know, your pyramid there, or your diamond shape, excuse me, your diamond shape symbol. And so it's asking questions. Which patients are currently referred? Are we missing diagnoses? Are we including our SCAD patients, our type 2 MIs, our LVAD patients? You know, who decides which patients are referred? We need to ask that question. And then we can ask some tough questions, because some of our failures will come out, our opportunities for improvement will come out of this. You know, are the surgical patients killing it? Are surgical staff killing it? And they're referring 60% of the patients that they see that are eligible. And maybe our heart failure patients, the national average, I think, is like 5% of patients get into cardiac rehabilitation. Well, is it because they aren't referred? And if you've got an eligible, you know, HFrEF patient, are they in the referral process just like your MI and your REVASC patients are as well? So as you can see, this is just an example of trying to blow things up and ask more detailed questions. And I'm hoping as I'm talking, you're starting to register that, you know, maybe we could get more granular in this area or that area of our referral process, building towards, let's say, an automatic referral. If that was possible, that would be ultimate. You know, where there's an opt-out mechanism, that'd be an ultimate way to try and build something like that. Same thing here. We've taken an action step, you know, here, you know, or an activity. You know, the EMR triggers an order to prompt cardiac rehabilitation. Well, how are these patients, you know, identified? Is the resident going ahead and using the right order set when they discharge the patient? And when are these referrals or these, you know, these order sets brought up and the refer to cardiac rehabilitation box checked off? Is it checked off by the nurse? Is it checked off by the physician, you know, senior staff physician, or the fellow or the resident discharging the patient? And what triggers it? Are we triggering it based upon hope and luck that the physician remembers, or is it already blacked in and opted in, and the physician has to opt out? And again, are there differences between medical and surgical? All of this has to be crossed over and applied to a whole host of different, you know, other steps in the process. But it all requires us to think about it as we move through. And again, surgeons may be different than those that are non-surgeons, that they may want to wait. All of our patients have to wait 6 weeks before they start cardiac rehab, you know, despite the fact that we really want to get our patients into cardiac rehab, let's say within 3 or 4 weeks. Even our surgical patients, get them walking mildly on treadmills. So this all has to be built into the calculus as you think along the steps. So mapping, but we also have to coordinate with the work of others. So we have to coordinate what we do with others that are initiated, and it might be with other programs. You know, you may be discharging as a tertiary care institution in Michigan, Southeast Michigan. We might be discharging up into Traverse City, Michigan. You know, and who follows these patients to make sure the patient enrolls? Do you have outbound callers? Do you have schedulers who work the work queue in your EMRs? And are we tracking the number of sessions? And is the patient getting a first session? Are they starting in cardiac rehabilitation? So all of these are good steps for us to go ahead and think about as we go from referral to program completion. We have to, you know, coordinate across the full spectrum. Could be finances. It could be the beast of transportation, which we all know is a concern. But these other players in these other teams have to be pulled in to make sure we have good communication, patients are selected correctly, and we're coordinating across the full gamut. And I'm hoping now that you're starting to sense that some of this stuff is outside my world. It's the cath lab, it's billing people, it's administration, it's IT. And that's what we're talking about. We're broadening out the hat so that you kind of have to get smaller to get bigger. We've got to pull these people in to get granular to get this big picture done. So let's get a little bit more specific about mapping it out, and that includes capturing data. And I will tell you, having worked in healthcare for 40 plus years, that although perceived comments and intellectual comments from my peers and others often help, sway a group, or those that can orient the best often sways the group. What really helps anchor decision making is good data collection and doing it with data. So if you really want to change a process and a group says, no, this is what we perceive, and you feel like it may not be, then let's work with the group to collect data on either side of the discussion, both sides of the discussion, to find out what's the data telling us and is that true or not. So as you go through this process, you have to start to ask questions. Where does the data reside? Is it in your EMR? Is it in your corporate enterprise warehouse? Is it in your administrative databases within cardiology or within your office? How do we capture the data? How do we pull it out? Is it something that I need a programmer to do from the health system, or somebody in IT to help pull this data out? And more importantly, is there new data that's not captured? For instance, discharge to start time. When the patient's discharged from the hospital to their first visit in orientation or cardiac rehabilitation, what are all the data elements? We want to shorten that down to 21 days or less. Well, what are all the elements? Well, I need discharge date. Can the EMR give me that? I need first visit in cardiac rehabilitation. Can the cardiac rehabilitation program do that? Do they have that information on paper, or is it electronic? And then can we mesh those when we get it all in some type of spreadsheet that we can start to compute, mean days to start cardiac rehabilitation? And then who oversees the data? Do I have to talk to a supervisor in billing or a supervisor in IT? This is common sense stuff, but I have to tell you, data is what drives the discussion. You can make a change based upon what the data is telling you, and then evaluate the effectiveness of the change by recollecting the data. So you can see it really helps tell the story for you. So as we iterate, move along, start, launch, make changes, what are the opportunities for improvement? Here's a couple just tips that you wanna think about and keep in the back of your brain. Hold on for 1 second. Thank you. Okay. The first tip is just observe it. You don't have to rush into this. You're in this for the long haul. We measure this in months or years in terms of process change, and it's never ending. It's continuous process change. What you do today may be different than what you do 18 months from now, and each of them may be involved with process change along the day. We want to reduce variability, do things in an organized manner. As I mentioned, we want to, determine what and when the data is collected on referrals and enrollment. What are the sources for those? So take a minute and try and capture the data, your current data. Your IT people, your billing people can tell you, all the people that were discharged from the hospital this week. Well, in 6 months, you can tell us how many of those patients got into cardiac rehabilitation, or if they didn't, maybe they were referred to a local hospital or to a distant hospital, or they declined. It's that type of data, referral and enrollment and follow-up that we want to look at. And guys, be a little bit detailed here. Be granular, get under the covers, look at what's going on, lift the hood, really try to get specific on the level of details that you're trying to collect. I'll also say, and I've mentioned this before, involve stakeholders in the process, whether that's the physicians, whether that's your physician champions, whether that's your patients, or whether that's other people from your team, and then start to look for variability. Can we shift practice and get things so that we reduce how Mary does it and Tom does it and Barry does it, so that we all try and get in a like approach And maybe it's insurance verification. Can we go through one person rather than 3 people doing it in 3 different processes? And then again, as I mentioned before, it may take multiple iterations, multiple changes in the process along the way to really get to where you want to, again, on a metric that you've agreed is important. And let's say that is number of people referred or number of people that begin cardiac rehabilitation.
Stephen, before you leave that slide, can I just ask you to expand a little bit on the variability comment that you just made? What happens as you're doing your process mapping if you find out that, you know, one shift does it one way, a second shift does it another way, if, you know, one person does something one way? How do you map a process when you realize that a whole bunch of people do it in a whole bunch of different ways?
Okay, good question. Two prior points I would make is you want to always try to shrink variability. That's our goal so that we get to like processes we best we can. In addition to your comment about one shift doing it one way and one shift doing it the other, we introduce variability when Mary teaches Tom how to take a blood pressure or get a consent signed, who then teaches Larry, who then teaches Harry over the span of 8 months, or new staff, and each of these people have involved variability along the way. The best way to tackle the variability is to get, at least in my eyes, and Steve, you can comment, is to get all the right players in the room that are involved in, let's say, the referral process. So the cath lab nurse, the inpatient liaison, or the physician doing the order from the cath lab, whatever it happens to be, across the 2 or 3 shifts. And let's first agree on, do it with data. We're only getting 30% of the patients who go through the cath lab into cardiac rehabilitation. Referrals on this is we're only getting 15% of the referrals. Or we're getting 50% of the referrals, but only 30% of the people are getting in. So you would have people from both shifts in this meeting where you want to map out the correct process and to start out assigning responsibilities, what data points do we have to collect, so you get all the players across different shifts to map out what we all agree on is the preferred process from in the cath lab doors to first visit in cardiac rehab or completing cardiac rehab. Does that help, Steve?
Yes. So it sounds like what you're saying is that maybe the initial process mapping, as you go through it, you might wind up with like 3 or 4 different maps reflecting 3 or 4 different ways that something is currently done. But then based on those things, as you continue to discuss with all the stakeholders, you'll come up with a map which describes, you know, how you want the process to work in the future. So, you know, you may have some maps of what how things currently work, as well as a map of how you want them to work moving ahead. And capturing both of those things may be really useful for the hospitals.
Yeah, well, I guess I'd make the argument, you're correct. I would make the argument it's capturing that first map of what's currently happening that is the stepping off point for everything going forward. Because you'd be able to get on there, what do we want to look like down in the future? And you know, what are our challenges? What are our you know, sources of input? Get as much as you can on that first one, and that really helps move things forward and get as many people as you can involved with that.
Yeah, thanks. And that ties into the last point you were making about needing the multiple iterations. So that's right. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Next slide, if I could. So we're back to the whole now of what we had shown before and all the different process steps along the way. Again, the diamonds represent decision points, and the rectangles of different shape represent some tasks and things to do along the way. And then the oblong oval, or the, you know, rectangle there with the rounded edges represents, you know, a stop or a start point. So you can see we've really mapped this out, and in some cases you can have you know decision points that step off of a task. So, you know, in the middle there you can see patient agrees to enroll in cardiac rehabilitation. You know, okay, then what are all the cardiac rehabilitation steps that have to happen to get this patient, you know, rolled? And then if the patient says no, you know, you document the reason. Well, I would say we can probably blow that up, so to speak, and in our own internal quality initiative, call 50 patients and say, why did you say no? And if some of those are solvable, if some of those are barriers, can we circle back and plug this someplace into the map to get these patients back into the yes column versus a no column? Because some of them might not be medically eligible or childcare eligible or transportation eligible. Maybe those are some things that we can solve. So there's some insights that we can gather from this whole workload process, and one is this whole issue of maps to identify process gaps, things that we can work on. We use the word failure here, but maybe these failures are opportunities for improvement. We've heard that phrase before, where we can design and implement something different that moves us towards, let's say, better automatic referral with effective care coordination. That's kind of the big picture there. But then we want to capture insights from, what's working and what's not. Again, as Steve mentioned, that off-shift person may say, well, this doesn't work for us when we're working the 7 to 11 shift. And this map doesn't work for us because we can't pick up the phone and call somebody at 8 o'clock at night and get a liaison over here to come visit with the person prior to discharge. So they see it differently, and we want to capture those insights from others as we build our first map and our iteration maps and move forward. Then there's this concept that we're going to introduce called a fishbone design, and it helps categorize, what things we want to redesign around. And let's say the redesign around happens to be redesigning for better referrals. It might, it helps us redesign around the issues that we have to address. This is just a simple, taking the initiative to mark things up and blow things up and ask critical questions. You can do this on your map. You can get granular. You can develop your map and send it to another person who's familiar with the process and let them look at it and tear it up and say, is this correct? Is this incorrect? What's your sources here? Do you have any missing diagnoses? Have you considered this type of patient, that type of patient? What happens after graduation? Is there a follow-up data that we need to monitor? You yourselves and others can provide other level of thinking that can blow up some of these diamonds or rectangles so that we get more information or better information that provides better care and workflow across the whole map. The map is just a tool to help us really move this process forward. I mentioned a fishbone design, and you can see here an example of one. If you look to the far right, you can see we're trying to capture reasons or concerns or categorize, major buckets of why maybe patients aren't referred to cardiac rehabilitation. And none of these will surprise you, right? Eligibility wasn't identified early on. There was a referral process failure. Maybe there was if somebody was entered into the work queue or a referral came in on the fax machine and it just wasn't picked up or it got lost or whatever happens. Maybe the patient wasn't referred. And we often say, well, the physician didn't refer the patients. I will say that still occurs. It occurs much less than it did years ago, especially for the surgical and the PCI patients. Referrals from those now nationally are above 80%, but for medical patients, they still are low. So, what can we do to hook your physician champions to work with their colleagues to make sure that whether it's paperwork or a button checked in an EMR, are those things getting done? Making sure they understand cardiac rehabilitation holds benefit. So we're putting this right now in different buckets. And then the last bucket would be maybe the patient, and maybe they may say no to cardiac rehabilitation. And what are the sub issues that are associated with that? Whether it's depression or whether it's medical issues or social issues, that these are the things that we can blow up as we move forward, collect data around, help solve barriers that we want to work on to help really drive better referral to cardiac rehabilitation. Okay, so just as I'm coming down the home stretch here, I want to keep in mind that something I mentioned earlier, and that is that we're in this for the long haul, you guys. We're measuring this in months, not measuring this in days, measuring this in multiple months, not measuring this in days or weeks. And you will be given more skills and more opportunities to work on this and develop this as we move through other modules going forward to help talk about, how do we map out and how will this drive their referral process? And all this will divide subsequent, even later modules that maybe will help with implementing effective care coordination, et cetera. So we're in this for, a multi-step process, and it's a long haul picture. So I want to take an opportunity now to introduce Mackenzie, who's done a wonderful job of putting into a real life session or real life picture a lot of what we've talked about before. So we're going to take a couple of minutes and hear from her journey, and I'll stop there and say, Mackenzie, you are on.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Katayan. I appreciate that. So the story that I'm going to share today is really for my hospital. My team was a true call to action on the part of the Aspire SWASA Hospital Cardiac Rehab team. In 2016, we were invited to be part of a cardiac collaborative that was with other organizations through the state of Wisconsin. What was measured in that collaborative with cardiac rehab was just its utilization as a whole. So the outcomes they looked at were cardiac rehab enrollment and completion rates. And as we sat at the initial meeting, the main questions really were to us was this cardiac rehab program completion rates and enrollment rates at the WASA hospital as excellent as we thought they were? Were we the ones that should present on this? The question was asked to me specifically, and at that time, I knew that we entered data, I knew that we recorded outcomes, but I unfortunately didn't have that concrete block to stand on at that point in time because I didn't have the exact numbers and the data, like Dr. Katayan spoke to be able to speak to how good our program was. So one of the surgeons stood up to me, looked right at me and said, you need to know your program and you need to know your program numbers. You need to understand them. You need to know when they're good and you need to celebrate those moments. And you need to also know when they're not so good. And you need to own that. And then you need to figure out ways to move forward and make those improvements for those outcomes. So for me, that was a very eye-opening experience. I had been in the field at that point for about 10 years, and I knew that we needed to take this back to the team and we needed to start somewhere quickly. So the question truly was, where do we start? We knew we had to get this data moving forward. We knew we had to present on it. So fortunately for us, we had, and you can do next slide, thank you. We had the automatic referral already in place at my organization. So we knew in our hospital, 99% of eligible patients that we saw in our hospital were already referred to cardiac rehab. We were kind of that hub center, so we did definitely refer out. But of our patients at the WASA hospital, our enrollment rate in 2016 at that time was 65%. Our completion rate for cardiac rehab was 70%. We knew that those numbers for our team wouldn't be acceptable. We knew that we were going to have to do better than that, but we did want to see what we were up against. So we basically pulled the national average, and at that time we found that enrollment to cardiac rehab nationally was 19%. So again, even though we looked really good against that, again, we knew that we needed to make some change, because if we presented this to our cardiology and surgical team, this wasn't going to be what they wanted to see. So the question was, where do we start and how do we implement action to see changes in those numbers? So our current workflow at that time was pretty simple. We had a liaison up on the cardiac floors or throughout the hospital. We had that automatic referral, so that individual would go and meet with a patient when they were referred. They would discuss cardiac rehab, what it was, if there were questions the person had about it. We maybe talked about a little home walking program, but then we would tell the patient, someone will call you and get you scheduled for cardiac rehab. And that was pretty much the end of that enrollment piece. For completion, what we found was there wasn't a real good process, if you will. So we would have patients that were dropping out, and I think some people would assume why they were dropping out. Others would make a phone call, maybe, maybe not. And so we found that we had to really beef up on our completion and how we were going to improve upon that. So we needed a plan, and to do that plan, we first had to pick somebody to kind of lead and champion this, which was me at that time, just because of the role that I was in. However, I do say that this was kind of a very interesting thing for me, because I always wondered, you know, why are people not enrolling? Why are we not having our patients complete our program? So, you know, my key thing with even my whole team is anytime we do any outcome thing, we want to have a leader, a champion, because it helps to drive, it helps to motivate all of us. So having that was key for us. What we did to sort of start the planning or what we were going to do for these is we basically started at a staff meeting. So our first upcoming staff meeting, we allotted a chunk of time to be able to sit down as a team or as a staff and really talk through some of this. So as Dr. Gatayan mentioned in his presentation, you have to look for the stakeholders. So we kind of sat down, and our first thought was, who can we reach out to talk through some of these things with? And the first and kind of most important key one for us in this specific outcome was the surgeon's office manager. We reached out to her, and she was very excited, to say the least, to meet with us and talk with us about some of what they're hearing, what they know. And I will tell you, initially, that was a little bit of a challenging conversation, because again, this wasn't something that we always would do, and we were a little intimidated maybe. But I will tell you, I think that when we did that, we really understood that people are very interested to help and to give the information and to share ideas. And so as we do this more and more, it becomes much easier. The other thing that we did then for both of these was a lot of what was just talked about with the mapping process. And I will tell you, the enrollment was a little easier with the mapping, and we had a little bit smaller map, I guess, if you will. But that completion rate is, when we did the mapping for that, our team, that is where we found some significant variability, like was just discussed, in processes across the board. So we found that, you know, this staff person in their case management did it a certain way, the person next to them was doing it another way, the next staff person another way. And so we really had quite a messy post-it board, if you will. But that really did help us to be able to sit down and kind of almost look at what is working well, what is best practice, I guess, in this sense, and how can we kind of make this a little bit more streamlined so everyone is doing it the same way and utilizing the ways that work the best. We even went as deep as actually pulling each staff person's caseload and finding out, you know, who had the highest dropout rate and who had the highest completion rate for the patients that they were overseeing. And not to point fingers at anybody, but it was also helpful to see that, because it kind of helped to prove and show that some of these processes that were being used were actually working and they were successful. So that was very exciting to see too. So other than some staff meetings and maybe some lunch and learns with each other to kind of do follow-up and go through some of these mapping process, I also met with staff one-on-one at times just to kind of follow through on goals and challenges that we had asked of each staff to as we went through this process. So it wasn't a huge extra amount of time. It kind of fit in our day of what we had already scheduled. And I know cardiac rehab, we're always, you know, rare on time and rare on staff and resources. So that was key for us. So after identifying those gaps, those opportunities with our meetings and one-on-ones, we made some simple small changes that actually showed really very, you know, great improvement to our program. So the enrollment process, what we really did was we changed a lot of verbiage. So instead of making it just a suggestion or a conversation, we talked through how could we present this as a recommendation, or not not a recommendation, but this was something that was an expectation. So the physician had ordered cardiac rehab, and that's then how we presented it. A referral was through for you, and we will be scheduling your first appointment so that you have that before you are discharged from the hospital. So that first initial cardiac rehab appointment was then scheduled right next to their surgeon follow-up, to their cardiology visit, to their lab appointment. So it was something that was almost more like, now this is something I have to attend because it's here on my list of things to do, if you will. We even went as far as calling outside facilities, because again, we are the major hub for our organization. So we do a lot of outside referrals, and we got contacts for all of those referrals and would even reach out and contact those other programs so that we could potentially even get them an appointment scheduled, which seemed to even help across the board for other programs as well for enrollment, which was very exciting to see as well. So again, by simply changing our verbiage, making that appointment, what we noticed is our 65% enrollment rate in 2016 went to 73% in the first quarter of 2017. And then after 1 year's time, so the calendar year of 2017, we had a 90% enrollment rate at that point. With completion, again, we, after all of our mapping and all of our trying to figure out what actually was best practice or worked best for our program, again, it was a change in verbiage. How are we going to follow up with these patients? And we determined basically kind of a phone call system. So if patients were not coming or failing to come, staff would give the phone call to a patient. 3 phone calls were sent out, I guess, if you will, once a week for 3 weeks. Unfortunately, there are people that, will drop out, so they wouldn't return calls or we were unable to reach them. But I would say the majority of our patients we were able to follow up with, and we talked through that. We'd actually have a conversation. Why is it that you aren't coming? And what we found was, it really wasn't a matter of that they just quit. It was a matter of something was different. Maybe the time that they were coming was no longer working with their work schedule or their kids' schedule or whatever it might be. Or maybe they had, a concern on a piece of equipment that they didn't want to use anymore. So to be able to have those conversations and talk through that with our patients, we actually really noticed an improvement in our completion, because we were able to bring a lot of those patients back and just kind of continue to move them forward to complete the program. So our 70% completion rate in 2016 increased to 76% in the first quarter of 2017. And then at the end of the calendar year 2017, we had an 82% completion rate for our cardiac rehab enrolled patients. So again, we made changes along the way. So kind of as they spoke to it, this isn't always something that just happens overnight. This was a whole year's worth of work and data that we did for these numbers. And this is something that we continue to work at. We have a binder created with that new scripting that we used. We have information so that if staff need a refresher or have questions, I am a resource for them, but there's also this binder there for them with a lot of resources as well, so that if I'm not available, there's somewhere they can go, or even working with each other. So this final slide then, I just like to share because this really demonstrates our program, commitment to improving our patient or program care. This is something that we use pretty much daily. It was shared with us by Lauren Tice of Froedtert Cardiac and Pulmonary Rehab. And she had created this for kind of an outcomes perspective. And like I said, this is kind of a thing we use daily. And I always say that first one, understanding, is just like the surgeon had said to me, you need to understand your data, know your numbers, review those numbers, take that information and identify where things are great and celebrate those things that need to be changed. Let's make a plan and do that. And so that moves you into that creating stage where you use some of this mapping and you figure out, what can you do to change and plan and make things happen. So then you're going to improve, and within those changes and plans, you might need to change along the way, but you continue to do that, and you then move to the empowerment stage where you are empowering each other, your team, and you're utilizing those stakeholders in there as well. And I always say, I even encourage my staff to empower the patients, because I think when the patients are excited about our positive change, the staff gets more excited about our positive change, and we typically see more change, and sometimes more quickly. So that's been very cool for us. And then again, you're back to knowing your numbers with regular review and things like that. So I would say, get something like this on your next staff meeting agenda, and start it when you can. And again, it's not something that's going to happen overnight, but definitely kind of a fun process along the way. So I will turn it back over to you.
All right, Mackenzie, thank you very much for lots of practical advice, lots of good examples of the value of process mapping, and lots of passion for making things better for your patients and for your staff. So thank you for that. As we look at the next slide, we really would like you to share with us the one insight that you've gained in the last 45 minutes as we've been talking about this, that you think is going to help you as you move into process mapping and gear up for automatic referral and changes to care coordination. So take a second and jot that into the chat. And then if you had questions that came up that you didn't put into the chat already, we'd encourage you to put those into the chat as well. We'll compile those questions and make sure that we are ready to address them and can answer any questions that come up in your peer action group that will take place in the next week or so, depending on your schedule. So share those insights with us. We got a question about disclosing the definition of completion. And I know that there are multiple definitions of that. I'm sensitive to time, but we'll get those definitions and share those in your peer action group along with other comments. And if you think of other questions as you mull this later today, tonight, by all means, just send us a question to the Take Heart inbox, and we will be happy to respond to those questions there. If we can jump ahead to the action steps for next, we just want to stress, I mean, you might have listened to this and said, well, I kind of get process mapping, but I don't think I'm still struggling with the nuts and bolts of doing it. And that's the purpose that we've got both the implementation guide, that which you'll be emailed in a day or two along with the slides from today. We'll give you lots of that practical how advice that you need to get started and to continue your process mapping journey. And then we want you to also be prepared to discuss your challenges, what you're learning in your peer action group in the next week or two. Those are set up to really complement these trainings and enable you to have a discussion with peers about how you're doing things and how you can do them better. In this case, as you go through the process mapping over the next month or two. So those are the next action steps, and we'll follow up with the slides and other materials from today. Next month, on July 29th, we will be focusing on data. That came up a lot today. It's absolutely critical, and we'll discuss that on the 29th. You can go ahead and register for it today, and we'll include the link when we send out the materials in the next day or so as well, to help you understand your data. And we really want to stress for you, if you haven't already done the data planning activity, we really want you to do that in the next month so that you will know where you are going into that data planning session. And if you're not sure where that data planning activity is or whether you've done it, you can check with your peer action group lead and they'll be able to help you. They'll send you a copy. They'll let you know if you have it. They'll give you a copy of what you sent us in case you've lost track of it. But we'll get you ready because we want you really to be prepared for data. So so that's coming up. And the last thing that we'd like you to do, as always, we're interested in how we can make these events as useful as possible for you. So as we close out the session today, I want to thank our panelists again, Stephen Katayan, Mackenzie Peckman, for their insights. Thank you very much for that. Thank you all in the audience for your time today. We look forward to talking with you in the peer action groups. But if you could, as you close out, take a few minutes and answer the 5 feedback questions, that will help us make sure that we're doing these events in the way that is most useful to you as we move into Module 4 next month. So thanks very much. Have a lovely rest of your day, and an exciting time as you start mapping out your processes and seeing how you can enhance them to strengthen the care that you provide for your patients. Thanks, and have an excellent rest of your day.